Good evening. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. Welcome to Live from the Frontlines, the fight for our democracy. We're honored to be welcoming back journalist, author, and voting rights expert Ari Berman for a conversation with Workers' Circle Director of Social Justice, Noelle D'Amico. Tonight, as we reach the 100-day mark of the second Trump administration, we'll look at the president and MAGA's attacks on our democracy, as well as the growing grassroots resistance that has led in the past months to millions of people taking to the streets in protest. After around 40 minutes of conversation with Ari, we'll take time for your questions. Please put all questions in the Zoom chat or in the Q&A feature. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization celebrating our 125th year of fighting for our democracy. We were founded by Eastern European Jewish immigrants who fled pogroms and persecution in their homelands for the United States, seeking democratic freedoms and committed to building a better and more beautiful world for all. That history drives our work today. I want to thank the 28 organizations who have co-sponsored this conversation. You can see all of their names in the chat. Strong organizational solidarity and coalitions are critical in our fight today for democracy. I encourage all of you to learn more about their work. And now, Noelle D'Amico will introduce Ari and get the conversation going.
Thanks so much, Anne. We are delighted to welcome Ari Berman, National Voting Rights Correspondent for Mother Jones, a reporting fellow at Type Media Center, and the author of Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. You've read and seen Ari in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, NPR, and many other media. He won the Sidney Hillman Foundation Prize for Magazine Journalism, and tonight he's with us for an hour to talk about the fight for our democracy. Welcome, Ari.
Hi, Noelle. It's so great to see you again. Thank you so much to the Workers' Circle for sponsoring this, and it's great to see so many people on the Zoom from all across the country, and I just want to thank everybody for their hard work, all the groups that are sponsoring this, working so hard, and all the people on this Zoom who are just doing so much day to day to fight what we're going through in this country right now.
So today is the 100th day of President Trump's second administration, and in a little over 3 months, he has aggressively attacked the constitutional foundations of our 250-year-old republic and its people. President Trump is behaving as if the Constitution has no constraints on his executive power. He's signing rogue executive orders that defy the law. He's trying to disenfranchise millions of eligible voters. He's ignoring due process and greenlighting the abduction and incarceration of students and immigrants. And he's fueling a coordinated attack on our healthcare, our benefits, our data, our rights, our histories, our university, and any person, organization, or movement that stands in his way. This is our sitting president. And then there are moments like this one that on April 18th, when the horror is more accurately named as tyranny. And in doing so, people across the nation are catalyzed. Many of you probably saw the photo of what was displayed on North Church on the anniversary of Paul Revere's ride. Indeed. Ari, I want to start here with the astonishing fact that a sitting president of the United States is actively trying to destroy our democracy. In 250 years of history, can you think of any parallels to this moment? And what's different about what Trump is doing now? It's more than scale and scope, though those in and of themselves are staggering. And respond as well, if you would, to that thrill, that great yes we all experienced when we first saw that art projection recasting Longfellow's poem, The Ride of Paul Revere, on the side of Boston's North Church.
Pretty amazing image. Actually, I was on vacation then, so this is the first time I actually saw it. Really, really amazing to see, and to think that in many ways, this is what the founders were concerned about when they wrote the Constitution. And I think the Constitution has a lot of flaws, and I think the founding fathers had a lot of flaws, but they were particularly concerned with a Trump-like figure who would try to become another king and who would be able to sway people based on transitory passions, and who would be able to mobilize a faction based on self-interest at the expense of the common good. And so they really were concerned when they designed the Constitution with someone like Trump emerging. Now, in many ways, Trump is an unprecedented threat for all the reasons that you mentioned. And I don't think we need to go through all the things he's done. People on the call know this. I think what's different about Trump compared to other presidents may have been contemptuous of democracy. Other presidents may have not had the nation's best interest at heart, but their central project was not to destroy American democracy. That is what makes Trump different than anyone else. At the same time, I have to point out, and this was a big reason why I wrote my book, Minority Rule, was that while Trump is a unique threat, he's also a product of a broken political system. And he can't be a dictator. He can't be a king alone. He has to have enablers, right? And he has been enabled by a Congress that has been warped by things like gerrymandering and malapportionment. He has been enabled by a Supreme Court where 5 of 6 justices were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. He has taken advantage of a right-wing echo chamber that has become more and more powerful and less interested in the facts. So for all those reasons, I think it's important to contextualize that while Trump is a unique threat, he's also part of the reason why he's such a big threat is because the system in which he operates. And so what Trump has tried to do is he has benefited from an undemocratic system. But then when the vestiges of democracy within that system stand in his way, he has tried to bulldoze all of those democratic norms and guardrails to get to a point where we live in a completely democracy-free zone that is antithetical to what America has been throughout all its flaws for 250 years.
It's really shocking, the extent of the damage he's already done. And for a long time, I think these first few weeks, people were hoping Congress would do more, but it got clear pretty quickly that ordinary people weren't going to sit around hoping that somebody would do something. The first protests were actually launched in DC by a handful of young activists who ran outside the Treasury building with a few signs. They started as a handful, and day after day, it grew. And since the protests then, they've only multiplied now. On April 5th, we had over 3 million people in the streets in more than 1,400 cities and towns for the Hands Off March. I know a lot of folks on this call were marching on that day. And on Thursday, on May Day, this coming Thursday, millions more will take to the streets again. Ari, what demand are you seeing blossom from among the people? Where are you seeing it make an impact?
Well, one of the things that I think was a really big turning point moment was the Wisconsin Supreme Court election on April 1st, right before those May Day protests. And it was such an important election because it was the first statewide election of the Trump era, and because Elon Musk made it his personal mission to buy that seat in a way that we had never seen someone do before. And when Musk first got involved, there was a lot of concern that this was going to be a replay of 2024, that the richest man in the world was going to be able to buy a Supreme Court seat like he bought the presidency and the Congress, and that you were going to see oligarchy move not just from Washington, but to the states. And at first, a lot of people were really concerned about this and felt powerless about it. But then there was a tremendous amount of counter-organizing, and Wisconsin Democrats actually made their campaign called the People versus Musk. And the Supreme Court candidate that was running on the progressive side said, I want to talk about my opponent, Elon Musk, and made it a central part of the race. And what we saw is that the reaction to Musk, and by extension Trump, and what they were trying to do to buy the election, the reaction against that was much bigger than the ultimate impact of trying to buy that election. And the progressive candidate won by over 10 points, which was a huge turnaround from November when Trump won Wisconsin. And that wasn't the only victory we've seen, but I think it was so important because not only did they rerun the 2024 playbook, but they really reran it on steroids in terms of the amount of money. Musk gave more money in that race than any donor had ever given in a state Supreme Court election, which is just astonishing. And the fact that there was a backlash to it, I think, especially in a swing state, led me to believe that people want something different, that they, for whatever reason, they were dissatisfied with how things were going. They thought they would give Trump another try. Certainly, he's still popular with a lot of people. But the kind of politics that worked in November 2024 might not be working anymore. And that people are really willing to stand up and do something about it in the way that they might not have been during the last election, or they might not have been after the election when I know everyone was going through all these different stages of grief. And some people obviously are still there. But I really feel like there's a desire to not just preserve the democracy we have, but to try to build a better democracy and to try to resist oligarchy, to try to resist dictatorship, to try to resist fascism. And that is really leading to a tremendous amount of activism today.
I really want to say your comments about the Wisconsin election are really important ones. I know on this call, there are so many people who made calls to Wisconsin, who sent postcards to Wisconsin. We're a 501c3, so we were sending information to Black voters in Wisconsin with the help of the Center for Common Ground, one of the co-sponsors for tonight. And I know that when we sent postcards and when we were on the phone, people were telling us how concerned they were about Musk trying to buy that election. It's like a line got crossed, both by the magnitude of it, but also the sheer fact that they thought their votes were for sale. And there was definitely a pushback. Now, I want to move us, though, into thinking about the justifications that Trump uses for his attacks on democracy, because while what he's doing might be new, in many ways, the justifications are not new at all. They're from a very tried and true and shamefully effective playbook that many lawmakers and demagogues in our country and around the world have used before. For example, stoking hatred and fear of immigrants, for one. You explore this in your insightful 2024 book, Minority Rule. Walk us through some of the themes that you notice coming from this very old playbook. And do you think they're effective this time? Or could the American people be waking up?
Well, one of the things that one of the stories I really tried to tell in my book is that there has been this push and pull throughout American history between democratic and anti-democratic forces. And there has always been a push and pull between white supremacy and multiracial democracy. And I think those things have really reached a fever pitch today as we are heading towards a majority-minority future in which white people will not be the majority anymore, in which multiracial democracy is expanding to encompass a lot of historically disenfranchised groups. And I think there has been a very strong reaction against that. And I think Trump pulls from all of those different anti-democratic movements, whether it's the people that tried to overthrow Reconstruction and were afraid of multiracial democracy becoming a fact of life in the South and trying to implement white supremacy throughout American government, or the people, whether it was in the 1890s or the 1990s, that warned against immigration and trying to demonize people and this is a very old strand of nativism in in American politics. And so I think Trump represents a lot of these strands that have existed for a long time. But he's also put a new face on it, right? And one of the scary things about the last election was he was able to get support from a lot of new people with the nativism, the
Yes.
racism, the xenophobia, the misogyny. And that was really disturbing because I think people were thinking, how could so many people be sucked into this? And there's calls from some quarters, including calls from some quarters in the Democratic Party, to stop talking about this kind of stuff, to stop talking about race, to stop talking about gender, to stop talking about people's rights. And they think those are quote unquote losing issues. And I think it's really important to understand that we are facing a moment where multiracial democracy is under threat. And we're at this really pivotal tipping point of which way the country is going to go. Is the country going to embrace multiracial democracy and accept the diversity of the country? Or are we going to embrace the kind of country in which we basically have a white supremacist dictator running things? And that was something that was, I think, obscured by a lot of other issues in 2024, but I think is becoming clearer to certain people today.
So as we look at what Trump and his acolytes are doing, there seem to me to be three overarching goals of this presidency. One, to expand executive power to the point of it being uncheckable by Congress or the courts. Two, to exact vengeance against any person or group perceived to have done Trump harm. And three, to make as much money as possible for Trump and his billionaire class. Would you add anything to that bucket list?
I mean, I think those are three things that are really overarching. I think the third thing is really critical because that often gets overlooked. And to me, Trump really just cares about himself and the people that associate with him. And I think his overriding desire is to make himself as immune as possible from the rule of law so he can protect himself and his friends. And I think one of the things that happened in 2024 was democracy was an abstract issue for a lot of people. People said we're in this unique threat to democracy, but people didn't understand, how does that affect my life? And even still in the first 100 days of Trump, there's been a lot of talk about constitutional crises. And we're certainly not just in one constitutional crisis, but I would argue in many different constitutional crises that combine into one. But I think that issue is still abstract to a lot of people. But what people are concerned about is their day-to-day lives and things that affect them on a day-to-day basis. And one of the reasons why Trump has become more unpopular is that people have seen their day-to-day lives get worse or not improve. And they've seen how the chaos in Washington could make their lives materially worse. And so what I think is really important for people to understand is that as long as we have a rigged democracy, that will result in a rigged economy and a rigged system that will hurt a lot of people, including working people, middle class people. And as long as we have billionaires running the country with no accountability, that's going to lead to outcomes that are going to be unpopular that a lot of people don't like. And it felt to me like those two things weren't put together properly in November. The threat to democracy and the threat to all those things that people feel in their day-to-day life. And to me, that is becoming more obvious now. I wish it would have been more obvious back then, but I do think it's becoming more obvious now and people are putting those connections together.
They certainly are. When their kid can't get the medical care he needs, when they lose their federal job, when they are unable to send their kids to school and think that their children are actually going to learn American history in the fullest sense, instead of an erased history that whitewashes the past. We're all starting to really feel it. And I think also, Ari, the rank cruelty of this administration has struck a chord in our common humanity. I mean, who among us can imagine the deportation of a small child with fourth-stage cancer out of this country, a US citizen? Who among us can stand idly by when we see the video of masked ICE agents abducting students without showing warrants, without showing ID? There's something there that strikes a chord in us and that we need to somehow recapture. The cruelty of this administration and this movement is immense, but we are people of empathy, compassion, justice. We believe in human rights. And I think that part of it is getting reawakened right now.
Yeah.
One of
Well,
the, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, as a journalist, we have to just keep telling the stories, and we have to put faces on the policies because these things can be abstract for many people. Trump says, I want to deport 11 million people who are here illegally, and people say, great, let's do that. They shouldn't be here. Then you start telling stories of, listen, they're not deporting people that are here, quote unquote, illegally. They're deporting people here legally. And not just that, here's who they are. Here's who their stories. And then people start to say, okay, that's my relative. That's my friend. That's my neighbor. And maybe in the abstract, I believe some of these things. But
Yeah.
when it becomes personal and you understand the stories, then it starts to break through. And so on the issue of immigration, I mean, that was Trump's strongest issue in supposedly in the last election, according to polling, one of his strongest issues. That's now a major vulnerability for him because people are seeing the stories. And so that's what I've always tried to do in my reporting on voting rights was to try to tell those stories, because I think if it's about statistics and cases and obscure references to history, people kind of gloss over. But when people see that we're talking about real people's lives and people that are more like you than you might realize, then it starts to hit home. And there's so many case studies like that. And that's what makes it difficult is what do you choose, right? Because there's so many people that are affected right now. But I think we just have to keep telling the stories, and we have to try to tell the stories to reach as many people as possible and to form as broad of a coalition as possible to resist that. Understanding that people are going to have disagreements about things, and not everyone has to agree on everything. But there's a lot of common ground to say this is not what America should be. This is not what America stands for. Even if you thought this might be a good idea, we've gone way too far.
Absolutely. These are our neighbors. These are us. They might not be us today, but we know we're next. That this is just that what is happening to one is our concern. I'm thinking about the people in Charlottesville who tried to interrupt the ICE arrest that was taking place. And now they're going to be charged by the Trump administration, apparently, for that Good Samaritan act that they took up. I'm thinking about the way now that people are beginning to see themselves in the picture, whereas before it might have felt at a distance. As Andrea Miller from the Center for Common Ground likes to put it, some are often first and worst, but in the end, it's about us all. And so people, I think, are waking up and asking, what can I do? I know here at Workers Circle, we've seen people come off the sidelines in droves, and that gives me some hope. I want to turn to yesterday's Washington Post, which I thought had a really marvelous opinion piece by 3 law professors that insisted Trump's fake emergencies are the real crisis. because he uses these emergencies to then claim the court can't touch him and to chill speech and gain compliance far beyond his actual targets. Their essay did a good job reminding readers of the real limits of presidential power and the ease with which Trump's lies have penetrated the psyche of our national conversations, and that sets the stage for voluntary compliance and the sacrifice of our rights. Honestly, sometimes it feels like there is so much lying going on, it's impossible to rebut because there's too much. One can't get one's footing. Saying these are fake emergencies seemed like an excellent way to me to go to the root of the problem. I'm curious, are there other ways that you have broken through the sheer volume of lies, misdirections, and rage that pour out from this administration on a daily basis, Ari? Are there certain regular, bigger lies that they are telling that we should pay particular attention to? Or is maybe chaos simply the point?
Well, I mean, I think you're right in they're just trying to throw so much at the wall to see what sticks. That you do 10 crazy executive orders and 6 get struck down, but people don't forget about the 4 that didn't get struck down. And honestly, if he issues 10 executive orders, we'll be lucky with the courts that we have if 6 do get struck down. I mean, that's just the reality of it, that a lot of these things have been challenged through the courts. And at the same time, look who is on the courts, right? The same Supreme Court that ruled that Trump had the power of a king and did not allow there to be a trial for the insurrection, which I think would have changed not just accountability and precedent, but I think could have changed the entire election. So I'm not saying the Supreme Court's not going to rule against Trump. I'm not saying that the lower courts are not going to rule against Trump. We've already seen that happening. But the courts are not enough to save us. I think that's very, very clear. And I think what people have to do is they have to pick their issue that matters to them the most and really try to work on that, because it can be overwhelming. And even for me as a journalist, it was really overwhelming. I started covering, for example, that Wisconsin Supreme Court election very early on, because even though it was just a Wisconsin Supreme Court election, I knew it was going to tell us a lot about where the country was headed. And I knew it was going to have outside significance. And I knew that if I started bringing attention to that case, I was not the only person, but I thought, if I was to bring attention to that case, that was something that could break through. And it ended up being an example of a story that did break through, that got a lot of national attention, and where the Trump plan backfired. So I think the same has been true of immigration, that yes, Trump has done a lot of bad things on immigration that have not yet been stopped. I think we can all admit that. At the same time, a lot of his policies that he thought he was going to put through with very little resistance have become a lot more controversial than the administration realized, and have been a liability for the administration, and have led to a backlash, and have endangered his broader project. And so that to me is really important. I also think it's important to realize that, yes, Trump wants to be a king, but he's also in many ways a weak president who was becoming increasingly unpopular, who is now a lame duck, despite what he says about changing the Constitution to run again. And so when you start to treat him as someone that can be challenged, that can be defeated, that can be organized against, that opens up the limits of possibility, as opposed to just saying, this guy's a dictator, this guy's a king, this guy has the courts and the Congress in his back pocket, and we can't do anything about it. That was the attitude of a lot of Democrats after the election, right? That what's the point of resisting? We can't do anything about it. And people said, screw that. We're going to resist anyway. Even if we can't do anything about it, it's the right and moral thing to do. And by doing that, they've started to change the consciousness and the awareness of what this administration is doing. It made it a lot easier to oppose what he's doing and to show that another possibility is there.
Yeah. You know, the people really woke up many members of Congress when they came home for recess at their town halls, confronting them, telling them they wanted to understand why they were behind this, asking for accountability. The people have really reawakened Congress, and we're starting to see some movement from them now. And we'll see where that goes. We got to definitely keep that pressure on. I want to focus for a moment on Trump's executive order on elections, which was released just days before the Wisconsin election that you were talking about earlier, and the Florida special elections that were taking place. This is executive order called Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections is a massive voter suppression bill that would require documentary proof of citizenship among registration. It would allow Doge into the voter rolls. It would require states to stop counting mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day, contrary to state law. Trump's executive order is part of an overarching attack going on voting rights that features a bill called the SAVE Act, which has passed the House and is awaiting action in the Senate. That bill would require voters who are registering or re-registering to produce either a birth certificate that matches the voter's name or a passport, documents that millions of Americans either do not have or would require expense and time to get. Both the executive order and the SAVE Act are using the myth of non-citizen voting to try to stop tens of millions of citizens from participating in our democracy. So Ari, here's the question that's puzzling me. Why are Trump and MAGA lawmakers targeting the voting rights of tens of millions of people in a way that would harm voters even in their own party, even in states that overwhelmingly voted for them? What's going on here?
Well, I think what they're trying to do with the whole push for proof of citizenship is they're really trying to fuse two of the biggest planks of the MAGA agenda, which is anti-immigrant hysteria and voter fraud paranoia, and to combine them together and to say all these non-citizens are voting and we have to stop them. Now, first off, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in American elections. It's exceedingly rare. It makes no logical sense why they would do so. But I think it's important to point out that this is much worse than voter ID, that voter ID laws are harmful to the people that don't have the right type of IDs. But 90% of the public, or roughly that number, has those IDs. You talk about proof of citizenship. People do not carry around their passports or birth certificates with them when they go to register to vote or interact in their daily lives. 146 million Americans don't even have a passport. 21 million Americans don't have ready access to their citizenship documents. We saw with the SAVE Act, there's a lot of people that could be affected by this. For example, 69 million women have taken their spouse's name, so they can't use their birth certificate to then register to vote. This could be incredibly problematic. And interestingly enough, it's Republican women that are much more likely to take their partner's name. And so therefore, it could potentially disenfranchise Republicans more than Democrats. There's also in the SAVE Act, there's a provision, and this to me is really crazy, that you have to register to vote at an election office.
Yes. Yes.
Meaning that people wouldn't be able to register online, they wouldn't be able to register by mail, you couldn't do voter registration drives. I mean, that would quite literally take us back to the 1970s, 1980s when it comes to registering to vote. And again, that is something that could affect a lot of people in red states and more rural areas who would have to drive many distances, something like 8 hours in some cases, to be able to register to vote. So I think we have to point out that this is a solution without a problem, but I also think we have to show what the burdens are here, because people are going to hear ID, non-citizens, and they're just going to think like, what's the problem? And so we have to drill down and tell the story of who could be affected by these kind of things. Now, I'm heartened that yes, the SAVE Act passed the House. Doesn't seem like it's going to pass the Senate. I think there's even a number of Republican senators that have concerns about how this could impact the fact that Republicans said when Democrats tried to pass voting rights legislation not too long ago, they said the states run their elections. Well, this would be a massive federal power grab. At the same time, Trump's executive order, the courts blocked the requirement that you have to show proof of citizenship to register to vote. And other litigation is working its way through the courts because the president doesn't have unilateral power to set election rules. So I'm hopeful this will backfire, but it is very dangerous. And the number of people who could be impacted is significantly larger than the restrictions they've been pushing in the past.
Yeah. Look, talking about elections brings me back to 2023 when we had you on for a conversation and we were looking at all the new state voter suppression laws that had passed in the wake of Trump losing the 2020 election. And you talked about them as, well, you got to think about these new laws as being on the front end and the back end of the election system. On the front end, you got voter suppression. On the back end, you have election administration now falling into partisan hands. You told us to watch the state. You said, get in there and build laws at the state level that'll protect people's voting rights. You said, watch these states. And sure enough, that's where the action definitely has been. So that brings us to North Carolina, a judicial race and the ongoing attempt by one candidate to actually steal that election. Ari, you've been covering this. Talk to us about what's going on in North Carolina and why it's so important for us to watch.
It's incredibly disturbing because the Republicans in North Carolina they're running the Trump playbook from 2020 to overturn the election, but this time they might actually succeed because they control the court system there. So Democrat Allison Riggs led by 734 votes after 2 recounts. The State Board of Elections was about to certify the election in November, and they were blocked from doing so by the Republican-dominated courts there. The state Supreme Court has a 5-2 Republican majority. The Court of Appeals in North Carolina also has a Republican majority. And this is really astonishing because they've been trying to kick tens of thousands of people off the rolls, disqualify over 65,000 votes. They've tried to change the elections after the fact, change the rules after the fact in a way that is really unprecedented. First, they tried to remove 60,000 people from the rolls that they said had registration errors through no fault of their own. Then the court said you couldn't do that. So now they're trying to cherry pick the votes of overseas and military voters only in 4 to 6 Democratic counties in the state. I mean, this is really remarkable for people to understand this. Trump tried to do this in 2020. Trump tried to throw out votes, for example, in Wisconsin, only in Milwaukee and Madison, which were the 2 most Democratic areas. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, you can't do that. Well, now in North Carolina, they're only challenging ballots in these Democratic counties, which is a clear and obvious equal protection violation. But it's gotten very far to the point where both the Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court in North Carolina have ruled in favor of the Republicans. And this is not just a theoretical exercise anymore. They might actually overturn the election there. Now, the good news is that the federal courts have stepped in. The federal courts have temporarily blocked this from happening. People will potentially have a chance to rectify their ballots, but this has gone on for way too long. We're talking about 6 months after the election. They're only challenging certain ballots in certain places. They're not trying to disqualify ballots cast for Trump in the presidential race or ballots that were cast for other Republicans up and down the ticket in North Carolina. But they are trying to use this state Supreme Court race in North Carolina as a model for how to overturn future elections, understanding that the Trump playbook didn't work in 2020. But if they can do this successfully in North Carolina, they're going to use this as the model to export to other states. And that's why I think it's so critically important that people pay attention to this, because just like Wisconsin, this is much bigger than one Supreme Court seat in one state. This is something that has national ramifications about how elections work and how votes are counted and whether we even have free and fair elections in this country. Because if you have a situation where people voted a certain way and then you reverse engineer the outcome, to overturn the race because you don't like the result, that then calls into question the whole notion of free and fair elections and us living in a democracy.
We're going to keep an eye on it. You know, when things end up tied up in the courts, sometimes people look away because they're like, oh, the courts just have to do their thing. But I'm wondering, what are you seeing on the ground in North Carolina? What are North Carolinians doing? How are they fighting back and make their voices heard?
Well, I think one of the things they're doing is they are speaking up and telling their stories and telling the stories of those people who are impacted by this. Military voters that have voted without problems for years, suddenly being disenfranchised. People, young people who cast ballots while they were studying abroad, suddenly being disenfranchised. And these personal stories really matter because they've informed the litigation in the case. And again, this stuff can be very abstract. It could be a lot of numbers, a lot of court cases, but when you see who the people are that could be disenfranchised and who could, and what it could mean ultimately, it starts to break through. And people are very angry about this in North Carolina, and not just Democrats. A lot of Republicans are very concerned about what this could mean as well, because who's to say they wouldn't be on the receiving end of this? We don't know where this would stop ultimately, and so there's a lot of concern about it. What the thing that troubles me is, as bad as what Trump tried to do in 2020 was, it was over at some point, right? The elections were certified, the votes were counted, despite an unprecedented effort to prevent that from happening. We're 6 months out now, and the North Carolina race is still not certified. It's still tied up in the courts. And so to me, this just sets a really troubling precedent. And I think people just need to keep talking about it, keep getting it in the news, keep making it a national issue, not just a state issue. So there's pressure on North Carolina to do the right thing.
You know, we're at the 7:43 mark. I'm going to turn to some of our questions that are coming in the Q&A, and friends, keep putting them in there. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. I want to start with a question on North Carolina. Someone wrote in saying, my 2 children and I are overseas North Carolina voters. Our votes are being challenged under the Griffin lawsuit. We vote in one of the 4 Democratic-leaning counties that's being targeted. My son's votes are 2 of the 237 votes being challenged as never resident votes. I am profoundly concerned about what this says about the fate of democracy in North Carolina and the US. This is a blatant act of disenfranchisement. What can I do from abroad, and how else can I make my voice heard?
Well, I think that people who are concerned about this issue should get in touch with the different groups in North Carolina that are working on this at the state level, whether it's Common Cause North Carolina or the different indivisible groups, or there's a group called North Carolina for the People Action. There's been a lot of groups that have been organizing on this issue, and they've been organizing it on it in court, so that there are plaintiffs and people that are fighting these efforts. They've been organizing it in terms of the media, telling these stories. They've been protesting and talking about it. Someone mentioned in the chat, Allison Riggs has a legal fund. That is true. She has to pay for these 6 months of lawsuits to be able to do this. These other groups have to be supported too. So I think in terms of telling stories, volunteering, sending money, and then if it gets to the stage where people have to validate their votes, where we're not at this stage yet, but this is a possibility that people could have 30 days to submit and upload their IDs if they didn't submit them, even though it was not required at the time. That's going to be a massive organizing effort to try to reach these people. And so that's going to be something that people from around the country can help participate in to make sure that the North Carolinians that are affected by this aren't disenfranchised by Republicans through no fault of their own.
Yeah. I have a question here that's asking, how can we help pro-democracy members of Congress slow down the anti-democracy aggression in Congress? Are there actions that they could take and employ to stifle the advance of what we're seeing? Any thoughts on that, Ari?
Well, I mean, I think things have to pass both houses of Congress, and the math is different in the Senate than it is in the House. So you take the SAVE Act, for example. The fact that there was such loud opposition to the SAVE Act in the House meant that it's less likely to pass the Senate. And there are not 60 votes in the Senate to pass this. And so that matters, making these things an issue, showing that there is concrete opposition to this matters. At the same time, the House is very, very narrowly divided. So Democrats can think about what they can do in terms of drawing attention to things and potentially trying to gum up the works a little bit in terms of the narrow majority. At the same time, in the Senate, the Senate gives a lot of power to the minority party. We saw that with how Republicans were able to block Democrats from doing a lot of things. Now, Democrats have that opportunity to block things that Republicans are doing. One of the things that was frustrating to people in the early days of the Trump era is it didn't feel like Democrats were using the power they have to try within the institutional structures that existed. And hopefully that's something that's changing. If you can't change things institutionally, then you have to work outside those institutions, right? And we've seen that. We've seen people start to get more aggressive about the tactics they use and start to say that not everything has to be done inside Washington, that we can counter things outside Washington, that we have to build a broader movement. But this movement is not going to come from the leaders of the Democratic Party. It's going to be pushed by the people pushing the leaders of the Democratic Party. Because I think about the civil rights movement. I mean, you had so many years of activism before the Congress did anything. The Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill in '57. It was weak. It was weak. They passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1960. It was weak. They passed the Civil Rights Bill in '64. It was better, but still weak. Then it had to culminate in the Voting Rights Act, and that was not the end of the process, but that was a lot stronger. And so there was years and years and years of activism. It didn't stop with one bill, didn't stop with one sit-in, one freedom ride, one protest. This was something that had to build momentum like a wave. And so I think people have to remember that too, that there's a lot of work that has to be done to build here. And each step leads to another step in terms of building that foundation to then not just resist Trump, but to try to then create an alternative future and an alternative political structure that works better for people.
We were just down for the 60th anniversary of the Selma Bridge crossing in March. And one of the most extraordinary things was our ability to talk with people from across the country who were quite serious about continuing to build a truly multiracial movement to win these advances that we so desperately need. So I want to just remind everybody on the call, do not give up hope, because we, the people, ultimately it's in our hands. And if we keep moving and we keep pressuring and we keep reaching out to each other, we're going to get there. We are going to get there. Now, Ari, I saw this question and thought, oh, this looks like right up your alley. The writer says, you know, it's important to talk about solutions too. How can we stop Trump? And more importantly, the people who are running our government behind the scenes, they're even more insidious. And I'm thinking about how you chronicled all the dark money and the various groups that led to judicial appointments. Say a little bit about that. Should we be working on that too at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it can feel so overwhelming in terms of the things that need to be done. But I do think that we need a wholesale revamp of our current system, because the way that you have someone like Elon Musk, the world's richest man, buying the White House is from years and years and years, decades and decades and decades of deregulation. The fact that yes, Donald Trump did win the popular vote this time, but he still gained power the first time by losing the popular vote, almost won again despite losing the popular vote by more, and then this time was helped by a Supreme Court that was a product in so many different ways of minority rule that fundamentally changed the entire tenor of the election. You look at the House of Representatives. Republicans hold the House right now because of gerrymandering, because they captured the North Carolina Supreme Court to talk about what we discussed earlier. They reinstated a gerrymandered map that gave Republicans 3 more seats in Congress than they otherwise would have had. And that's the difference in terms of the majority right now. And so these structural issues matter a lot. It's not, we don't have the democracy we have by accident. These anti-democratic features of our democracy were either built in from the beginning or they've emerged over time. But they owe themselves to a lot of anti-democratic actors that have taken advantage of the system. And in many cases have changed it for the worse. And so that's why I always talk about, yes, Trump is a unique threat, but he's also a product of this broken system. And so I don't want us to lose that now people are going to be worried about the day-to-day things that are right in front of them, right? The things that affect their daily lives, people losing jobs, people losing health care, people being deported, people having to pay dramatically more for things for no good reason. That's the things that people are concerned about right now. But in the back of our minds, we have to keep thinking about these structural reforms. Because if we don't do something about this broken democratic system, there's going to be more Trumps in the future, even after Trump's gone.
Yeah. Well, that's a thought. One of the participants tonight wrote a really difficult question. The person wrote, my mother was born in Germany in 1927, lived in Nazi Germany 1933 to 39, while her older brother left in 1936. People ask me, how did my mom's brother know it was time to leave? What were the signs? Why did my mother's father wait so long to apply for visas and then find Baltimore Jews to sign an affidavit to sponsor 2 young girls? He waited so long, they were on a 5-year wait list and then had to start over again and apply, and it goes on. The question really is, how do we know? What are the signs? And I'm lifting that up because I think that really is a fear for some folks in our country right now, no matter who they are. This person has a family history of deep trauma, and so many people in our Jewish community have seen the signs of this rising fascism for a long time because they and their families have lived through it before. Ari, how do we know? When is it time?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's almost unknowable. But I think that history is very personal for me. Both of my grandmothers lost almost their entire families in the Holocaust, had to flee at very young ages in very difficult circumstances to get here. It was not easy. They were not welcomed in America. America did not make it easy for them. As we know, that's another shameful part of America's history that doesn't get talked about enough. And when we talk about deporting refugees and turning our back on people, we have to remember all those people that we turned our back on then and how many people died because of it. So I understand people's concerns here, and there's a lot of disturbing things happening right now. The question is, can we do something about it? Can we fix it? Are we at the point of no return, or can something be done to change it? And are there enough guardrails left? Is there a broad enough opposition left? Is democracy resilient enough to withstand this? And I don't know. I mean, I don't think that anyone knows. No one can give you a definitive answer on this question. I do think that a lot of people who thought about leaving, and some have left for sure, but a lot of people who thought about leaving have decided to stay and fight and feel like the fight is worth having. If people feel like it's too much, it's too late. I don't think anyone will begrudge them, but I think that if you look at the number of people that are joining protests, getting involved in activism, doing things in their local communities, a lot of people still feel like American democracy is worth fighting for. That's how I feel, but it's an ongoing fight. And one of the commenters said, there's a lot of comments, I can't keep track of all of them, but one of the commenters said, no, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that's something to keep in mind. We're not going to change everything overnight, but things have already changed. We're in a much different place in the 100th day than we were at in the first day. And we could be in a very different point in the 200th day and the 300th day that we're at now. So I do think it's really important for people to keep that in mind.
Yeah. I think what I'm seeing as I'm part of the Worker Circle is so honored to be in a number of democracy coalitions where we're constantly talking with partners about what's happening on the ground. And what we're actually seeing right now is people come off the sidelines like never before. People who have never made a call to their member of Congress, people who sort of were like, well, I'm not really into all that politics stuff. I vote, I do my part. But no more than that. Those people are saying, this is crazy. What can I do? And some of them are out there figuring out themselves in their local communities, supporting one another, taking action locally. And so I think it's a moment to decide for all of us. This is ours. History has handed this into our hands, and it is up to us to pick up the mantle and to fight for our democracy wherever we leave. All kinds of actions are needed. All kinds of actions are needed. Maybe you can't go to the front lines of a march because maybe of health considerations, or maybe that's just really not what you want to do. But you know what? There's plenty of other things you can do. You can engage your member of Congress. You can give mutual aid in your community. You can find an immigrant rights group and say, how can I help at this time? There are things that every single one of us can do right now for one another and for our democracy. Ari, as we close our program, I want to give you the last word. Say whatever you will. Send us out with some thoughts.
Well, I think that was a really good point you made, that everyone can do something and everyone has a role to play. And if we step back, that creates a vacuum and someone else is going to fill that vacuum. And that's what we saw after November, that the vacuum was being filled with by a lot of people who had a lot of bad intentions. And now we're seeing the resistance to that.
Yes.
And we're seeing a lot of people get involved and not waiting for orders from the top, but doing things wherever they can. And I think a lot about John Lewis, who is my personal hero, and I think about how he marched in Selma, Alabama for the Voting Rights Act, and how he led that march on Bloody Sunday, where you were recently, for the 60th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday map. When he crossed that bridge with 800 protesters, and he was 25 years old, and all he had in his backpack was an apple and an orange and 2 books. And he saw 800 Alabama state troopers facing him in gas masks with bullwhips on horses. How hopeless could it have seemed at that time? How immovable could that have been? But he and others, they marched anyway. And they knew they were marching for something that was bigger than themselves. So what I always tell myself is, if John Lewis can take on Alabama state troopers and win, then we can take on Trump and we can win. And so I think it's really important to remember that this is not hopeless, that tyrants have been defeated in America before, that undemocratic elements have been defeated before, that the pendulum hasn't always swung towards justice. It's often snapped back, to quote Barack Obama, quoting Martin Luther King. But at the same time, it's a fight that's always worth having.
It certainly is, Ari. Thank you for being with us tonight. And as we close our program, I want to thank our co-sponsors again and encourage you all to learn more about their good work. Remember, there are so many ways to be involved. Here at the Worker Circle, we have democracy circles forming all across the country to build grassroots power. We'll be out there on May 1st, and we hope that you'll join us there on May 1st. Tomorrow, you'll receive a recording of this program tonight and many resources that will allow you to take action now for our democracy and for our future. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight and for your determination to continue the fight for our democracy. Together, we will write the next page of our nation's history, and we'll make it one that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be proud to read. It will say, when tyranny threatened, we responded with creativity, with power, that we picked up the mantle that has been handed to us to renew that enduring pledge that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. See you on the front lines. Good night.
Thank you.